The city lights flickered to life as the evening commute began its heavy, rhythmic crawl. Thousands of people were focused on one thing: getting home. Among them was Elena Ward, a tired nurse in wrinkled scrubs, walking home after a brutal 12-hour shift in the emergency room. She was invisible, just another shadow in the crowd. But then, a violent screech of tires tore through the air. A man collapsed in the middle of the busy intersection, and the world froze, while everyone stood back and filmed with their phones. Elena didn't hesitate. She stepped into the street and stopped the world. Truth was finally revealed. Elena Ward was 31 years old, and at this exact moment, she felt every single day of it. Her feet were throbbing inside her worn-out sneakers, a dull ache that pulsed with every step she took on the hard, unforgiving concrete. She had just finished a grueling double shift at Metropolitan General, a massive factory of miracles where time was measured not in hours, but in medication doses and trauma codes. Her scrubs were wrinkled, stained with a faint coffee ring from a break she barely remembered taking 4 hours ago, and her hair was pulled back in a messy bun that was slowly coming undone in the humid evening air. To anyone passing her on the busy sidewalk, Elena was effectively a ghost. In the grand, loud hierarchy of the city, she was just another anonymous medical worker heading home to a cold dinner and a few precious hours of dreamless sleep. People didn't see the woman who had spent her entire afternoon holding the hand of a dying veteran or calculating life-saving dosages in the middle of a chaotic cardiac arrest. They didn't see the scars on her knuckles from years of CPR or the depth of the medical library she carried in her mind. They just saw a tired woman with shadows under her eyes, a nobody in the endless sea of commuters. The atmosphere of the city at dusk was a heavy, stagnant mixture of exhaust fumes and the distant, lonely hum of sirens. It was a world in a hurry, where empathy was often a luxury that no one felt they could afford. Elena clutched her bag to her side, her mind already drifting toward the silence of her apartment. She was exhausted, physically, mentally, and emotionally. She wanted nothing more than to shut out the noise of the world and find the peace of her own four walls. She felt like a battery that had been drained to its last 1%, pushing herself through the final 3 blocks of her journey. The streets were a canyon of glass and steel, echoing with the frustration of drivers caught in the gridlock. People walked with their heads down, eyes locked onto glowing screens, disconnected from the reality of the people breathing beside them. Elena moved through this indifferent landscape like a shadow moving through a forest. She was part of the background, an invisible anchor in a city that was constantly spinning out of control. She thought about the godlike surgeons she worked with, men and women whose names were on the wings of the hospital, and she realized that out here, in the dirt and the noise, none of that mattered. But as she reached the corner of 5th and Main, the rhythm of the evening shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. A heavy metallic thud vibrated through the air, followed by the sharp, agonizing sound of a person hitting the pavement with sickening force. A cyclist had been clipped by a turning car, sent tumbling into the center of the 4-lane intersection like a rag doll. The world didn't stop to help, it stopped to watch. Within seconds, a circle of bystanders had formed at a safe distance, their faces illuminated by the neon signs of the shops nearby. The reaction from the public was a perfect, heartbreaking demonstration of the bystander effect. People were frozen, not by compassion, but by a paralyzing, selfish uncertainty. Some pulled out their phones, their screens glowing as they recorded a tragedy for social media, perhaps hoping for a few likes on a video of a man's worst moment. Others whispered frantically to each other, but no one moved toward the figure lying motionless on the asphalt. The heavy air grew thick with a collective discomfort, a selfish kind of relief that the body on the ground wasn't them, mixed with the fear of getting their hands dirty. Elena stopped at the curb. She looked at the man in the street, she looked at the crowd, and she felt the leaden weight of her own exhaustion pulling at her limbs. She could keep walking. She could tell herself that someone else had already called 911. She could stay in her role as a civilian and let the system handle it. She had already given 12 hours of her life to the city today. Wasn't that enough? But Elena knew the truth about the system. She knew that the first few minutes after a trauma are the golden minutes. the thin, vibrating line between a recovery and a permanent, silent tragedy. She saw the man's leg positioned at an unnatural angle and the way his chest was fumbling for a breath that wouldn't come. She recognized the pattern of the fade, the specific way a human soul begins to detach from the body when the oxygen runs low. She realized that if she didn't step in, the man might not survive long enough to hear the sirens of the ambulance she knew was still minutes away. She stood between two choices, the comfort of her home or the chaos of the street, the safety of the sidewalk or the danger of the intersection. She took one deep, rhythmic breath, adjusted the strap of her bag, and stepped off the curb with a purpose that made the people nearby look up. She was the only person moving toward the center of the storm, while the rest of the world was running away or standing still. She wasn't a hero in a cape. She was just a professional who refused to look the other way. She was the code whisperer, and her shift wasn't over yet. If you believe stepping in when others hesitate matters, comment. That is unfair. The intersection was a scene of absolute, unmanaged entropy. Cars were backed up for blocks, their headlights cutting through the growing darkness like accusatory, unblinking eyes. Drivers were honking, their faces red with a misplaced anger, unaware of the tragedy unfolding just a few yards ahead of their bumpers. The man on the ground, a young man in his 20s, his helmet cracked and his bike twisted into a pile of junk, was gasping, his eyes wide and vacant, a sign that his brain was already entering a state of shock-induced panic. The crowd was loud, a disorganized chorus of, "Someone do something," and "Is he dead?" The noise was a secondary trauma, a psychological weight that was making the situation worse for the victim. Elena realized immediately that if she didn't take control of the environment, she wouldn't be able to save the patient. In a crisis, the most effective medical tool is often a commanding voice and a clear mind. She had to shut out the static to hear the heartbeat. "Give him space, please step back, clear the perimeter," Elena shouted. Her voice wasn't a scream. It was a professional directive that carried a density and a frequency that made the people nearby actually flinch and obey. A few teenagers filming with their phones didn't move at first, their lenses still focused on the man's pain, as if it were just content for a feed. Elena didn't ask again. She walked straight toward the one standing closest and placed a firm, cold hand on his shoulder. "I am a nurse. I need you to move this circle back 5 feet. Now, help me create a lane for the medics." The sheer authority in her gaze, a gaze forged in the high-pressure, life-and-death bays of the ER, broke through the teenager's screen trance. He lowered his phone and stepped back, pulling his friends with him as if he had been struck by an invisible force. Slowly, the suffocating wall of people began to recede. A small, sterile-like pocket was formed in the middle of the city's madness, a temple of focus in a cathedral of noise. But the street was still dangerous. A taxi driver, frustrated by the delay, was trying to edge his car around the fallen man, his front bumper inches away from the cyclist's head. Elena stood up, facing the oncoming traffic with her palms out, the universal ancient sign for stop. She looked like a small stone standing in the middle of a rushing, angry river. "You!" She pointed to a businessman in a tailored suit who was standing frozen at the edge of the sidewalk, his briefcase clutched to his chest like a shield. "Go to that intersection and tell the drivers to stop. Don't let any more cars through. Use your body if you have to. Now!" The man didn't argue. He didn't ask who she was or why he should listen. He simply mirrored her urgency and ran toward the oncoming traffic, waving his arms. Within 60 seconds, the roar of the engines began to fade into a series of rhythmic idles. The congealed mass of traffic became a wall of protection rather than a lethal threat. Elena had turned a chaotic street into a makeshift trauma bay. She had reorganized the geometry of the city to favor survival. She knelt beside the cyclist, her knees hitting the cold, oil-slicked asphalt with a dull thud. She didn't care about her clothes or her exhaustion anymore. The ache in her feet was gone, replaced by the electric hum of the zone, a mental space where the world narrowed down to the patient, the procedure, and the pulse. She noticed the medical fog of war starting to settle over the crowd. People were still shouting, conflicting, dangerous advice. "Turn him over," or "Give him some water." Elena ignored them with a practiced discipline. She knew that in a trauma, doing the wrong thing is often worse than doing nothing at all. She needed to be the lighthouse, the fixed, unshakable point that everyone else could navigate by in the storm. I need everyone to lower their voices, Elena commanded, her tone calm but absolute, carrying over the hum of the city. The noise is making his heart work harder. It's triggering his fight or flight response. Give him the gift of silence so his body can focus on staying alive. The street went eerily quiet. The only sound left was the rhythmic clicking of a distant crosswalk signal and the shallow, wet breathing of the man on the ground. People were no longer just bystanders or spectators. They were now assistants in a delicate operation. They were watching a master at work, and they were finally starting to understand the power of quiet strength over loud panic. Elena realized that chaos doesn't need more noise to be fixed. It needs direction, and she was the only one in the 3-block radius with a compass. She reached into her bag for her stethoscope, a habit of a veteran who never truly goes off duty, even on her way home, and prepared to look for the truth beneath the trauma. She was the code whisperer of the street, and she was about to play the most important movement of the night. If you realize chaos needs direction, comment, I was wrong. Elena's hands moved with a mechanical, cold precision that no academy could teach. A speed and accuracy born of thousands of hours in the pit where the clock is the enemy. She didn't have monitors, she didn't have a crash cart, and she didn't have a team of residents to bark orders at. She only had her 5 senses and the cold asphalt beneath her feet. 1. The rapid assessment and categorization. Elena began the hierarchy of survival. She checked his level of consciousness first. Hey, can you hear me? My name is Elena. Look at my eyes, she whispered. She saw the man's pupils were dilated, fixed on the dark sky above. He was drifting into the red zone. She checked his breathing. It was agonal, a gasping, rhythmic failure that signaled the oxygen wasn't reaching the vital centers of his brain. She checked his pulse. It was thready, jumping like a trapped bird under her fingertips. She knew his blood volume was dropping, hidden somewhere in his torso. 2. Protecting the asset and the spine. The man's head was tilted at a dangerous, jagged angle. Elena used a folded wool jacket handed to her by a nearby woman to stabilize his cervical spine. Nobody touches his head, she told the crowd, her voice a low vibration. If his neck is compromised, a single move will end him. We treat him as if he's made of glass until the collars arrive. She was managing the physics of the trauma as much as the biology, ensuring that the rescue didn't become the second injury. 3. Coordinating the tactical communication. She looked up, her eyes scanning the crowd until she found a woman who looked focused and calm. You, stay on the line with 911. Don't hang up. Tell them we have a male, mid-20s, blunt force trauma, suspect internal hemorrhage and respiratory distress. Tell them the airway is currently being managed by a senior ER nurse. Do you copy? The woman nodded frantically, repeating the technical data into her phone as if she were a radio operator in a war zone. Elena was turning the bystanders into a tactical communication unit, making every person on that sidewalk part of the solution. 4. Managing the thermal leak. The man started to shiver, a sign of thermal leak where the body loses its ability to regulate temperature under the extreme stress of trauma. His metabolic engine was shutting down. I need blankets, or coats, anything to hold the heat in. Now, Elena barked. Within seconds, 3 expensive wool coats and a gym bag were handed over. The crowd was no longer a collection of strangers. They were a synchronized unit. Elena was the conductor, and they were the instruments playing the symphony of survival. 5. The mental anchor and limbic resonance. The man's hands suddenly gripped Elena's wrist, his fingernails digging into her skin with a desperate primal strength. His eyes found hers for a split second, a moment of raw, human terror that cut through the clinical layer of her mind. Am I dying? He rasped, the words sounding like dry leaves. Elena leaned in close, her face inches from his, creating a sensory tunnel that shut out the city. No, you're in the middle of a street and I'm your nurse. My name is Elena, and I've been doing this for 10 years. You're going to breathe with me now. In for 4, hold it, out for 4. Just look at me and ignore the world. She used a technique called limbic resonance, where she deliberately slowed her own breathing to a rhythmic, heavy pace, forcing the man's nervous system to sync with hers through sheer proximity. She was the only stable thing in his universe. Slowly, the gallop in his chest slowed to a steady rhythmic thump. His hands loosened their grip, his body surrendering to the safety of her competence. What people saw from the sidewalk was incredible. A busy, indifferent city street had been transformed into a cathedral of focus. The cars had stopped, the traffic was silent, and the crowd was standing in a reverent, protective circle around a tired woman in navy scrubs and a dying man. Elena wasn't performing a miracle. She was performing a sequence of actions in the correct order. She was holding a soul anchored to the earth with nothing but her will and her training. The 3 minutes she spent stabilizing him felt like 3 long years to the crowd. But in the history of that man's life, those 3 minutes were the only reason he would have a tomorrow. Elena noticed the cyanosis, the blue tint in his lips, beginning to fade. His oxygen saturation, which she measured by the color of his fingernail beds, was returning to a survivable level. She was the grease in the gears of life. Suddenly, the silence was pierced by the distant wail of an approaching siren, the sound of the gods of the road arriving. The crowd let out a collective, audible exhale of relief, but Elena didn't move. She didn't look up to see the lights. She kept her hand on the man's pulse, keeping the rhythm steady until the very last second. She was the anchor that wouldn't let go until the ship was secured. A young man in the crowd, who had been recording at the start, slowly lowered his phone and deleted the video. He realized that watching a miracle through a screen was a poor, hollow substitute for witnessing the truth with his own eyes. He looked at Elena with a new kind of awe. He saw the sweat on her brow and the dirt of the street on her scrubs, and he realized that the most powerful thing on that street wasn't the luxury cars or the bright lights. It was the person who stayed calm when everything else broke into pieces. Truth had been served with surgical precision. If you believe calm action can change everything, comment, "I am indebted." The ambulance arrived with a roar of diesel and a flash of blinding, rhythmic red and blue lights that danced off the glass buildings. The paramedics jumped out before the vehicle had even fully stopped, their gear clattering as they ran toward the center of the intersection. They were expecting a chaotic scene of panicking civilians and a messy, unmanaged site. But what they found was a perfectly managed clinical environment that looked like an extension of their own trauma bay. The crowd didn't rush them. The cars didn't try to move through the gaps. The intersection was a quiet, sterile zone. Elena stood up slowly as they approached, her posture as straight as a spear, despite the exhaustion screaming in her muscles and the asphalt dust on her knees. She didn't salute, and she didn't brag. She simply delivered a 60-second technical briefing that made the senior paramedic pause in surprise and check his own ears. Male, mid-20s, blunt force trauma to the torso and left lower extremity. Agonal breathing stabilized with a jaw thrust maneuver and thermal management using bystander coats. BP was thready, but pulse has rhythmic stabilization at 88. Agonal breathing has resolved, but he needs high-flow O2 immediately. I suspect a localized internal bleed in the lower quadrant. He's clear for transport, but watch the cervical stability during the lift. The lead paramedic, a veteran of 20 years on the road, looked at Elena's wrinkled scrubs and the shadows under her eyes. He saw the way the crowd was looking at her, not with curiosity or judgment anymore, but with a profound, unsettled reverence. He saw the mark of a professional who had been in the fire all day and had just walked into another one without a second thought. "Are you a doctor?" the paramedic asked, his voice full of genuine, raw respect. Elena shook her head slowly, a small, tired smile finally touching the corners of her mouth for the first time all night. "No, I'm an ER nurse. I was just on my way home." "Well, nurse," the paramedic said, giving her a sharp, formal nod as they began to lift the gurney with a synchronized movement. "You just saved this man's life, and you just saved this entire street from a nightmare. Thank you for holding the line until we got here." As the ambulance doors slammed shut with a heavy thud and the sirens began to fade into the distance, the spell of the street was broken. The traffic began to move again, one car at a time. The pedestrians resumed their hurry, looking at their watches. The lights changed from red to green. The city was returning to its baseline of indifference and speed. But the people who had stood in that protective circle didn't move immediately. They looked at the dark spot on the asphalt where the man had been lying, and then they looked at Elena Ward. The businessman in the suit, the one she had ordered to stop the traffic, walked over to her. He looked embarrassed, his earlier authority completely gone, his tailored suit dusty. I had no idea," he whispered. "I've lived here for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like that. Thank you for telling me what to do. I think I forgot how to be a human for a second." Elena didn't stay for the praise or the medals. She didn't want the spotlight or the thank you from the local news. She simply picked up her bag, brushed the asphalt dust off her knees with her hand, and walked back to the sidewalk. She merged back into the flow of the evening crowd, just another shadow in the dusk. To the people on the bus or the subway, she was just a tired woman heading home, a nobody taking up a seat. But to one family tonight, she was the reason the phone would ring with good news instead of a tragedy. Action had spoken louder than any title or any uniform. She was the code whisperer, and her mission was finally complete. She had straightened the world when it started to tilt toward tragedy, and then she vanished back into the silence. If you believe action speaks louder than identity, comment, "I will live kindly." The story of Elena Ward reminds us that true greatness is rarely found on a podium, under a bright spotlight, or behind a fancy title. It is found in the quiet, 45-second windows of crisis that no one else notices until it's already too late. We live in a world that is currently obsessed with stars. The ones who take up the most space, shout the loudest for attention, and crave the bright spotlight for their own ego. But the real anchors of our society, the people who actually hold the fabric of our safety and our sanity together when the storms hit, are the ones who stay ready in the shadows. They are the ones who master their craft in the deep silence of the night shifts and the quiet corners of the world. They understand that real impact is a service, not a status symbol. They are the ones who understand that a title on a door doesn't save a life, but a hand on a pulse does. Elena didn't do something extraordinary in her own mind. She simply did what she was trained to do with absolute surgical precision. But in an environment of total chaos and paralyzed inaction, doing the right thing is the most extraordinary act a human being can perform. She proved that you don't need a uniform, a badge, or a microphone to lead. You only need the clarity to see the truth and the courage to meet it without ego. She showed that the most powerful thing in a room or on a street is a mind that is clear of noise. We often overlook the quiet professionals in our own lives, the nurses, the teachers, the caregivers, the people who keep the world spinning while the rest of us are asleep or distracted by our own hurry. We judge them by their wrinkled scrubs or their tired eyes, forgetting that they are the ones holding the line when everything else starts to tear at the seams. We mistake their silence for a lack of knowledge, when in fact it is the highest form of concentration. You don't need a microphone to be heard by the people who truly matter. You only need the skill to speak the language of help and the immense humility to step back into the shadows once the job is done. Elena didn't wait for a thank you from the city or a medal from the mayor. She was already thinking about her next shift and the next life she would have to anchor. She understood that her legacy was written in the heartbeat of a man she would likely never see again. The next time you find yourself in a room full of noise, panic, and ego, look for the person who is staying calm. Look for the quiet observer who is measuring the rhythm of the situation and preparing for the next move. They might just be the nurse you need to get home alive, and they might just be the only reason the whole world keeps turning while you are looking the other way. Real strength is quiet. Real leadership is clear. And real heroes don't care if you ever know their names. They only care that the mission is complete and the people are safe in their beds. Be the observer. Be the master of your own pressure. Be the truth. Let your actions be the only announcement you ever need to make. Be the lighthouse. Because in the end, it's not the label you wear that defines your legacy. It's what the world becomes because you were there. Even if you stayed in the shadows until the moment the street finally stopped for you. That is the power of the silent professional. And that is the lasting lesson of the nurse who walked home. A story written in silence and saved in a heart. If you believe the people who step forward when no one else does deserve recognition, leave a comment below. And if this story reminds you that true courage is doing what's needed, even when you're exhausted, don't forget to subscribe for more.